So thank you everyone for joining us today. We are here with the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation Book Club, and today we are going to be talking to author Karen Odden. Karen, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, and I'm going to kind of put you right in the pressure seat and ask you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you've written.
It's a pleasure to be here. I always love chatting with you, Melissa. So I grew up in Rochester, New York, and I was the nerdy little girl who wanted to curl up in the corner with a book all of the time while everybody else was outside playing tag. And we bounced around a lot, my husband and I did, and eventually landed in Arizona. And I began writing my first real novel. Actually, I'd written a really, truly dreadful attempt at a novel when I was in my early 20s. It was sort of a mashup of Robert Ludlum and Mary Stuart and a article about Nazi war loot that I'd found. It was terrible. It's in a drawer where it belongs. But my first real attempt at writing a novel where I was sort of ready to do it, I think, was after my PhD at NYU, which I wrote my dissertation on Victorian railway disasters.
Yes.
And so I decided that I was home with my two children. Julia was 6 and Kyle was 2, and my husband was traveling like a crazy person. And I thought I was getting I definitely, my brain was getting a little mushy around the edges, reading a lot of Goodnight Moon. I decided, I thought, I want to try and write a novel. And what do I know about? Well, I knew about 1870s railway disasters.
Right.
And railway surgeons and injuries and all of the stuff that was going on in Britain at the time. So my first book, Lady in the Smoke, was about a young woman who was in a railway crash with her mother in 1874 London. This is where I began. I put him on a train and ran it off the rails. And it turned into a, sort of story about sabotage. And then I just ended up staying in the 1870s London for all the rest of my book. So A Dangerous Duet was my second one. That's set in the music halls of the 1870s. A Trace of Deceit, you see the cover behind me, that's set in the art and auction world. The next two, Down a Dark River and Under a Veiled Moon, are about an inspector at Scotland Yard, again, 1870s London. So I just kind of planted myself, and that's where I stay. And
over the year with the last two books, I would say a little bit different view of 1870s London. Who influenced you when you first had this idea of, I'm setting Goodnight Moon to the side and my own novel? Who were you kind of thinking of, I want to be like these writers? Do you have anyone specific in mind?
I do, and we often really lean hard on the books that shaped our reading experiences as children. Like I said, I grew up in Rochester, New York, and every Sunday we would go out to my grandparents' house, and they lived in Bergen, which is a tiny little town with one blinking yellow light. My brother and all the younger cousins, they'd all go out and play in the forest, and I would be sitting there in the library. They had one of these gold fur-colored recliners from the 70s, that tip forward and back. You could probably picture it.
Yeah.
And I usually would bring my own book, but I think that one day I didn't have my book, or I finished it or something. And so I thought, well, I'll see if I can find something to read here. I went to this bookshelf. I mean, there was floor-to-ceiling books, and my grandmother had, and I went to this bookshelf that was really colorful and bright. And so I pulled one of the books down, and I opened it up. I was about 11, and it had gold writing on it, and a pretty girl with long flowing hair and a ruffly dress, and a man with no shirt on. He'd lost it somewhere. And I started reading. And my grandmother walked by, and I had stumbled upon her little collection of bodice rippers. And so she runs in and kind of snatches it out of my hand and says, "Oh, you don't want to be reading that. How about these?" And she pointed me to this shelf that had Mary Stuart, Daphne du Maurier, Phyllis Whitney, Victoria Holt. And I would read sort of one a week. Those books, with their combination of a young woman who was resourceful but human and flawed, in an extraordinary circumstance, someplace exotic. Mary Stuart always set hers in like Greece or France or something cool, someplace I'd never been. Those things laid down tracks in my brain for the kinds of mysteries that when I started writing Lady in the Smoke and Dangerous Duet and Trace of Deceit, they were the foundation for me. Not that I necessarily realized it at the time, but looking back now, I see that.
If your grandmother had not walked by, we could be here talking about that. Is funny. So let's talk a little bit then about when you decided, I'm going to tackle my next project. How does that process come about? Do you plan ahead? Do you have outlines going on? Do you know who did it before you even start writing and how they did it? And what's kind of happening inside of your mind?
That is a great question. And I know that every author responds differently to it. For the most part, I begin with some aspect of Victorian culture. I don't want the Victorian era to be merely window dressing. I want to find a plot that could not happen at any other time or in any other place other than where this is happening. So, for example, in A Trace of Deceit, one of the things that inspired me was my work at Christie's Auction House in New York. Then I started researching into some of the things that were happening in the art world in London. And one of the things was the Pantechnicon fire, which was a fire that raged for 3 days in 1874 in Mayfair. And it was this enormous building right there in the middle of Mayfair, a big Greek structure that was ostensibly the safest place to put your valuables. And so when the London families would go away and go to France or, take a tour or something like that, they would take their valuables from their house in the city and put them in the Pantechnicon. Well, it was supposed to be fireproof and waterproof and theft proof and everything else. Well, it went up in flames and burned for 3 days. And every fire truck in London was there trying to put it out and keep it from spreading, of course, to the rest of Mayfair. Right. But millions of pounds worth of art and antiques and pianos and books all went up in flames. Wow. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And then the other interesting piece was that I found out that because people thought it was so safe, they underinsured. So, for example, if you wanted to store, say, 3 or 4 very expensive paintings, what you could do is have a headboard with a hollow slot, roll up the paintings and tuck them in. And then you'd pay to insure the headboard, but you didn't have to pay to insure the paintings. And so people lost many more things than they actually reported losing. So I thought that was really curious. Like, well, what if there was a painting in there that wasn't supposed to be? Or what if there was a painting that had been taken out of the Pantechnicon before the fire? And why was it? And maybe someone set the Pantechnicon fire on purpose. Ostensibly, it was an accident, but no one ever came to any kind of conclusion about that. So I begin with some element that's got some nice mystery pieces, and that becomes my opening. I think of writing a mystery as you have 2 pieces. You have the plot, which is sort of, dead body, fire, whatever's going to happen. And then you have the character arc. You have a person, you have a main character who's going to change in some way in response to the challenges and the things that happen in the plot. So you've got the plot arc, the character arc. And I needed to find a character who would do something. And for A Trace of Deceit, I do this with all of my books. I'm working through something of my own, here. I was a very, very gifted pianist who, and not necessarily as relational with people as he could have been, I think. And some of this had to do with his family. Giftedness is wonderful, but it can also, Annabelle, she has this older brother, Edwin, who's a forger, and he's incredibly talented. He's very, very gifted painter. I wanted to talk about giftedness. So I took something from my personal life and I kind of mixed it in with something from the Victorian era. Does that make sense?
Yes. I've talked to so many authors, and I think you are the first one I've ever heard say you take a certain setting in history and then shape it around that and then creating it off of that. But I think it's really interesting that you take a historical point here and then build off of that for your world. That's really fascinating. And having read your books, I can now see how, yes, that would not work in another setting. We can't bring it to a contemporary mystery, and we wouldn't have the same layers to it.
Right.
What was percolating in your mind as you were creating this mystery? So when you decide, then the second part, do you know who did it, how it's all going to come to be, or does that kind of take different shapes with each book that you write?
This is another great question. I think it's different for each book, but with a lot of my books, I don't always know a whole lot about my villain as I'm first starting out, because I'm getting to know my main character. For example, with Down a Dark River, which was my 4th book with Inspector Michael Corrigan, it took me a long time to get to know him, partly because he's Irish He's from Whitechapel, which is like the Jack the Ripper territory. It's not a nice section of town. He's a former thief and a bare knuckles boxer, and he's making his way in Scotland Yard, and he's nothing like me. So I had to spend a lot of time getting to know him first before I could start thinking about my villain. But what eventually happened somewhere around the halfway developing point is I know what my beginning is and I know what my ending is. And then it's the question of putting all those middle pieces in there. The book that I'm working on right now, I am pretty well done with the bones of it, and so I know where I'm ending. My beginning felt really solid. The middle part is still a little murky to me. There are certain struggles that I want my heroine to have that I'm trying to kind of slot in there. So I would say that that middle part is where you really have to step back. And that's when I pull out my index cards and I lay them down on my floor and I start moving them around to see how I can get the stakes to escalate and then drop a little.
It's really interesting that the story doesn't happen in a linear fashion as you're creating it, which I think, as a reader, we're just used to reading through and we assume that the words just poured out of your mind in this
No, yeah, I definitely write toward the end, but yeah, that middle section is, I think Hank Philippi Ryan calls it the muddle in the middle. It can be kind of murky in there for a while until you really start working out. And I think my way out of that is to find my secondary characters and make sure I know what they want. Because usually it's in opposition, the same as my main character. And so then that's how you can kind of insert that conflict, because you want those secondary characters to be really strong and pushing up against your main character and making them do things that maybe they don't want to do.
Interesting. So I say easy in quotes. Now you have a series, your other books are standalone. Do you get to know your character a little more and you can see how he might react to these situations as you're on book 2 and you now have an idea of his response?
But of course, then there's this other question too. When you're writing a series, how do you keep it fresh? Because, okay, so you've got this character arc. So once Michael Corvin has learned, for example, he came out of Whitechapel basically being a really good rescuer. He earns his place in the Doyle family by rescuing young Pat Doyle in an alley. He gets taken in by them. So he knows rescuing is a good thing. It gets me places, and it's a great skill to have as a policeman, right? You want somebody who wants to rescue. That's his instinct. That's a big part of his identity. It's all wonderful that you're a rescuer, but you're getting something out of this too. You don't ever have to be vulnerable. You don't like to be vulnerable. And I get that, but if you're a little bit vulnerable, you're going to be a better policeman. This is kind of what he has to figure out by the end of book 1. Well, then what do you do in book 2? Because he's kind of already learned what he's supposed to learn. But I think as people, we walk around the same tree over and over again. Like whatever issue we have, whether it's financial insecurity or trusting other people or whatever our baggage is, we don't just drop it the first time we learn something. We pick it back up and run around with it again. And so that's what I have Michael Corvin do in book 2. This time, his younger brother, Colin, is gotten into trouble with an Irish gang and he desperately wants to rescue him. This is going to be a theme that runs through, for Corvin again, but taken from a slightly different angle. So I think that's one of the things that's important is once you kind of understand what their baggage is, what that main character's baggage is, you need to kind of keep thinking about the ways it's going to keep rearing its sort of ugly head as it's only going to lead to trouble.
Can you please tell me you have signed another 10-book deal for that series so I can keep reading? Because, authors publish in different ways, whether indie publishing, traditionally published. Do you ever have a character that you think, I'm not ready to leave them yet? And even if you don't have a book deal, you want to write and take them on more?
I was really interested in the character of Elsie, Colin's twin sister, and how she steps up. She is overly spunky for the time period. I'm a little careful about that because I think sometimes when people read books set in the Victorian era, they can be a little bit off-put when a character is doing things that seem to be out of the time period. So Elsie is spirited, and she helps her mother run the store, but she's extremely observant. She knows her brother. She knows why he's doing the things he's doing. She understands her mother. She's just a really cool young woman, And like I would love to do like a short story about her. This past summer, I just kind of wasn't ready to tackle a novel. I was up in Utah with my husband. I was traveling a lot and things like that. But the short story genre is kind of almost like a playpen. It's only 5,000 words, not 100,000 words, and you can do something fun and interesting with maybe a secondary character that you don't want to let go of, and have them do something fun. You know?
I love that. It's so much fun for us as readers to get to see a little bit more of the story, and somebody continue on and maybe someday turn into a book of their own. Who knows?
Yeah.
Is there anything that you would suggest to those of us that really enjoy reading mysteries that would make the experience even more enjoyable? Things that we should be on the lookout for as we're reading a book that could help us get more out of the experience? Or do you just tell us to go in, enjoy it, and read away? There's no rules. Just have fun.
Jump in and enjoy, let yourself sort of be immersed in another world. Pay attention to those details like the food or the clothing or the gas lamps, and just sometimes go a little slow on those parts because you'll kind of get a little deeper into the world where you are. And many of them follow a similar plot arc. There's a problem or a dead body or whatever it is, and a series of red herrings and mishaps, and then eventually there's the solve at the end. Holding that knowledge in your head while is a little bit of meta knowledge, like how it's going to end in a way, can let you sink into some of the other parts, the character development or the setting or that kind of thing, in great part because we all sort of enjoy the experience of having a disruption followed by a reestablishment of order. It's a very deep need. Freud talked about it in his book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which he wrote about the soldiers who were coming back from World War II. Have you ever read that? The gist of it is that, when he wrote Interpretation in Dreams in the 1890s, his idea was that all dreams are wish fulfillments. Well, then you have soldiers coming back in 1915, 16, 17 with these horrifying nightmares.
Right.
He posited is that the nightmares that these soldiers were having allowed them to experience the horror without fright. They knew it was coming. Satisfaction in knowing that there will be a disruption, but then they will survive it. Like
in so many genres, like we read romance because we know at the beginning these people are going to be together and there's going to be some element that's going to tear them apart, but we know going into it that we're going to see them together in the end. So we have that same element, just like a mystery of disruption, back to comfort fantasy. We have the adventure happening and then the resolution. So that makes perfect sense.
We can tolerate the disruption, but we like the settling. So mysteries and romance and, all books where you begin and then you have some kind of disruption or problem or, pandemic or, whatever it is you're having. And then you reach some sort of resolution at the end. It's a deeply satisfying feeling. And people who read, or like Nancy Drew, or something like that, it's the same plot over and over and over again. And it satisfies some deep need in us for reassurance.
You just perfectly summed up a cozy read. It's right there, and it gives us that reassurance of it's all going to end okay. Perfect. I think there's a beautiful way to end because you did summarize that so perfectly and why we love mysteries. We love coming back to them. I would highly suggest your books to anybody that does love a historical setting that really immerses you. Your books make me want to research and learn more about the time periods. I feel like I need to reread A Trace of Deceit by candlelight. I think that would be a really fun challenge because it would totally immerse me in the experience. Candlelight.
And definitely not those smelly lamps that the Victorians used to use.
No. We will not go with those. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here and speak with us today. And it's always fun when I get to talk with you about reading and mysteries. So thank you.
Thank you.